So thank you all for coming back from lunch and staying through to the very end on a Friday afternoon. One should never overestimate the drawing power of standards to keep people in their seats. My name is Todd Carpenter. I'm the Executive Director of NISO, the National Information Standards Organization based in the US. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about standards initiative related to alternative forms of assessment, tied into a lot of the work and the topics that we've been discussing over the last couple of days. As an American here in the UK, I thought we'd draw a distinction between the Americans' inability to measure things in kilometers versus miles, and I thought it was apropos for this conversation. So how many of you are familiar with NISO? Okay. Oh, excellent. About maybe two-thirds, three-quarters of you. Fantastic. We are a national standard-setting body based in the United States, accredited by the American National Standards Institute. But despite our name, we're actually quite an international organization. About 20% of our members are not based in the United States and actively participate in our work. We develop technical standards for the publishing, library, and software communities. Standards that you're probably familiar with: DOIs, ISSN, ISBN. These are all things that are part of our portfolio. We've actually been working in the space of assessment since the 1950s. One of our seventh standard, Z39.7, is a data dictionary for libraries and performance metrics against which library services can be judged. We've also been involved in the Altmetrics space since 2010, I believe it was, when we partnered with Los Alamos and the Measure project. So the question is, how fast are we going? This is something that most Americans, when they come to Europe, don't really understand. Is it 60 miles an hour or 60 kilometers per hour? This is the Mars Climate Orbiter, which was launched in 1998 and arrived, unfortunately, to Mars in 1999. It didn't, unfortunately, survive the trip. It was supposed to settle in at a comfortable 160-kilometer orbit, but unfortunately descended to about 57 kilometers and burned up in the atmosphere because of a problem between pound-foot seconds and kilogram-meter seconds. They had two different systems and two different metric spaces, and so they missed, costing taxpayers about $200 million. And this is kind of a lesson for our community in that no scholar wants their career to end up like this. This is a shot from the International Space Station at a Perseid meteor burning up in the atmosphere. Now, I think this is certainly an overstatement. No one is relying, I hope, on alternative assessments or even traditional metrics on whether or not their career is successful or not. But it is something worth keeping in the background, particularly when we're talking about alternative metrics. Are we measuring things in English metrics or in metric metrics? So NISO was launched an initiative to address some of these questions, to address some of the infrastructure questions that we've been discussing in the last 2 days, with some generous support from the Sloan Foundation. So what is the infrastructure for alternative assessments? There's a variety of things that comprise that infrastructure. I know Jeff and Cameron had a lovely conversation about infrastructure. I think we're one of a small group of people who get really excited and passionate about that sort of thing. But it starts at a basic level of descriptions and definitions and vocabularies. Are we all talking about the same things? What does it mean when we're talking about alternative metrics versus article-level metrics versus metrics for software use? And how do these things differ? Another element of this infrastructure are the things that we use to identify the different elements of that infrastructure. So ORCIDs, ISNIs, the International Standard Name Identifier, which is used by Ringgold to identify institutions. We've got the FundRef initiative. We've talked a lot about ORCIDs and DOIs. All of these systems need to be created, and they're obviously based on standards. With alternative metrics, we start talking about issues of granularity. Traditional metrics have been at a journal level because that was what was easily collected. But in this new environment, we can collect information about specific authors, about specific papers, about specific institutions, departments, at what granularity we're collecting information. Obviously, we still want to know about the performance of specific journals, but we also want to know about the performance of collections, of institutional repositories. So how do we gather that data, and how do we tie it all together? Another issue that we want to consider is what's the timeline in which we're measuring information? Are we measuring information, traditional citation metrics, as Andrea mentioned, don't actually show up in the literature until about 3 or 4 or 5 years after the science is produced. If we want to talk about alternative forms of metrics and how can we accelerate that process, what's a reasonable time period that we're discussing? If we're talking about social media, that peaks a lot sooner than other forms of metrics. And eventually we want to focus on this really important question about reliable and valid metrics. Are we collecting things in an auditable way such that we can trust the results? Because unfortunately, there is a lot of variation in the providers of alternative metrics at the moment. I know this is a very hard to read slide, but this is some data undertaken by Scott Chamberlain at the University of Texas, published in NISO's Information Standards Quarterly last year, where he looked at 10 different articles and a variety of different metrics that are provided by different providers. And the difference that between where the dots reside is how different those results are against each metric. So one would think the same number of cross-ref data points would be the same if they're all pulling data out of cross-ref. But unfortunately, different providers are not coming up with the same number. So I unfortunately often in this particular environment often sound like a broken record in that there is defining what we're going to count, which ties to standards. So definitions and vocabularies. There's the metadata that we're describing, that is also standards. There is the infrastructure for exchanging that information, that's standards. There's the decisions about and procedures for counting and not counting things. Again, that ties all to standards. And those standards lead to this biggest question of how do we develop trust in these new forms of metrics? How can we ensure that we are comparing digital apples to digital apples and such that one provider's information is equivalent enough to another provider's information such that researchers aren't throwing up their hands and saying, well, these numbers don't match, so why should I trust them? So in 2012, I participated in the Altmetrics 12 meeting. That was an unconference of participants. How many of you were there? About 6 or 7 of the usual suspects. During that meeting, the afternoon, we kind of broke out into different groups, and basically we could talk about anything that we wanted to talk about, and I wanted to talk about standards. It turned out to be the largest of the groups. I think there was maybe 15 or 20 people who were interested in talking about it. So that led us to approach the Sloan Foundation, in that as the field of alternative metrics grew, it became obvious that it was going to have to rely on a variety of standards in this space. We don't know necessarily what those standards should be, but we need to do some work in this space. So we approached the Sloan Foundation for a 2-phase grant to look at these issues. We organized a steering committee of a lot of the usual suspects, a lot of the people who you've seen here. We drew from the publishing community, the library community, and the software and provider community. A lot of recognizable names there. Around about the same time, there was a lot of questioning about, isn't this too soon for standards? We don't even know what we're talking about, and how can you go ahead and standardize things? There's a lot of innovation taking place in our community. But this was a 3-year project, and we're about halfway through now, and we haven't produced anything. But simply by the fact that the meetings have gone from 40 or so people to selling out at over 100. There's a lot more interest in this. I mean, I'm going to be speaking next week in an STM webinar, and there's more than 450 people who have registered for that. Interest is rapidly growing in this space, and we needed to get out ahead of some of these definitions and understanding of what we're talking about. So my response to the how soon is it was, well, it's never too soon, let's get moving. So as I mentioned, this was a two-phase initiative, and as this is a nascent area, what we first focused on was brainstorming. And we undertook 3 in-person meetings to pull together different people and different perspectives. We also did a series of one-on-one interviews in order to get ideas from the community about what we might move forward with next. So those meetings, the 3 in-person meetings followed a kind of standard format. We had some lightning talks, 5-minute conversations from people who are doing different projects in this space. We then did a lot of brainstorming, put a lot of Post-it notes on the walls. We grouped those Post-it notes. We then voted on them to say, you know, these are the things we'd like to discuss. And then we talked about them. We also did 30 one-on-one teleconference interviews with people who underrepresented groups in those in-person meetings. We unfortunately didn't get the funder participation and the university administration perspectives that we had wanted. So we used one-on-one interviews to get more insight from those different people and those different perspectives. We then gathered up all of those ideas and summarized them in a white paper, which we published in early June, and solicited some public comments on that white paper. And these are we came up with probably more than 200 different ideas, which we grouped into 9 general themes, 25 different potential project ideas within those 9 themes. So the first is this question of definitions. What are we talking about? What are we talking about, and how do those things differ? From research assessment to quality assessment, scholarly impact, alternative metrics, altmetrics, all of these things, all of these terms that we're bandying about in the last 2 days. But do we actually have a very clear understanding of what we mean by those things, and can we describe it to a researcher who isn't sitting in this room? The second topic idea actually goes very closely with the last panel, and particularly Dan's talk about how do we apply these new forms of metrics to non-traditional scholarly output. If we want to create an environment of recognition for things like data sets and software and non-traditional outputs that are not papers, so to in a traditional journal, how do we apply new forms of assessment to those metrics? And how do we address problems of what does the use of a data set actually mean? How is a download different from a query? And what happens if a data set is incorporated into another data set? How do you manage that whole infrastructure problem and define the relationships between those research outputs in a way that we can provide meaningful metrics on? The discovery implications, a lot of us are focused on the assessment side of these new metrics. But as I can't remember who mentioned it yesterday, but there is a significant potential here to use these metrics for discovery purposes and other uses. And what are the use cases, and how can we apply them, and how can we apply them in a meaningful way? I mean, anyone who's ever used Amazon and seen at the bottom, the people who looked at this eventually bought that. That's a form of alternative metrics. That's a form of alternative assessment, alternative metrics through to facilitate discovery. So again, research evaluation is a significant and important part of this. But what are the role of new metrics, and how does that work vis-a-vis the traditional metrics? There has been some research about the correlation between new and traditional metrics. There might need to be some additional work in that area. Identifying specific scenarios in which these data can be used for metrics, and in what way, so that we can define some recommended practices for how institutions and administrations can use this data in a meaningful way. Data quality in gaming was another area of topic of discussion. You know, to what extent can we create systems that would acknowledge or identify gaming? How do we work with providers to identify that and maybe address it in a systematic way? How do we group and aggregate this information through the use of persistent identifiers? How do we promote the use of persistent identifiers in this new environment? How can we get institutions to buy into this entire process? And what is an appropriate level of granularity? Because the data needs, the data processing needs of article level metrics are significantly higher than they are at a journal level. At an individual level, these processes become very complex and challenging, particularly if not everyone's using an ORCID or using a FundRef or a institutional identifier. What's the context in which we are providing this information? What's the context in which we're using it? What are the use cases? How can these categories of data be used and aggregated? So this was an important element of potential work. And then finally, one of the problems that most standards have is not in consensus. It is in adoption and promotion. So if we create the best possible standard, but no one ever uses it, is that really useful? So how can we push forward on adoption and promotion? So this was the end of the first phase, was to take these ideas that we've generated out to the community, get some feedback from the community. We certainly will not be moving forward with 200 ideas or 25 ideas. Our goal is to narrow down to maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 different ideas of specific projects that we can move forward with in the next 12 to 18 months. The NISO Technical Topic Committee, that's our leadership committee for business information, will be assessing these project ideas and the community input that we've received to take a decision along with the NISO members about which projects to move forward with. Later this fall, we'll announce those projects, solicit volunteer participation from as broad a community as we can for experts to participate in that, and then the groups will go off, go forth and do the joyous work of consensus development, and then hopefully we'll publish some recommendations in 2016. And this is, I mentioned we'd taken the 25 different ideas. We've just closed a survey for the community on those 25 different ideas. And this was, we've had about 120 responses to that survey, and these are the 5 ideas. And on the next slide, they actually come out in text so you can maybe read them. These were the ideas that were ranked as either very important or important, with the definitions being the one area that there was pretty much consensus on. If we're going to do anything forward, we should develop at least taxonomies or vocabularies for what we're doing and moving forward with. Following closely behind that was the use of persistent identifiers. I know there is a lot of these identifiers already exist, but we need to do a lot more to promote them and get them actively used in the community. How do we enforce their use? How do we ensure that publishers are requiring ORCIDs when someone submits a paper, such that the ORCID is then part of the process? And I hate it when speakers look up at the screen, but this is so tiny. The next is data quality and normalization across providers. How do we focus attention on that? How do we get the... Now, obviously there are areas where different providers are innovating and coming up with new forms of metrics, and we certainly don't want to get in the way of that. But if we could identify certain metrics, and this is how this metric is calculated, and put that out into the community such that each provider can follow it, we'd go a long way towards advancing this. In the same way that Project Counter did around 2000 in defining download counts for articles. Next was looking at this question of different research outputs and how can alternative assessments be applied to research outputs. Then down a little bit further, standardizing APIs, standardizing ways in which data exchange can take place. Again, I think that's really critical. That's something that, again, Cameron and a lot of the people this morning were talking about. And then doing some research about the reproducibility of some of these metrics. How can we ensure that they are trustworthy across different providers? And kind of audit process. So that's where we stand. As I said, we're going to be pushing forward with at least 3 or 4 of those ideas in the next couple months. If anybody's interested, please ping me. One of the things that the Sloan Foundation asked us to do was to provide some alternative assessments of our alternative assessment project. And I'm pretty happy with how we've done. We've received almost 5,000 downloads of the white paper in about 3 months, which for NISO is pretty good traffic. It's not quite Nature traffic or New York Times traffic, but I'll take it. We had 21 substantive comments. We drew about 120 people in person to the meetings, and maybe 400 additional people were watching the stream at any given time, so we did have a lot of participation. There's been a lot of social media reference to this project, 450 tweets to the hashtag that we set up. So actually, if every one of you could tweet to something, we love NISO Almy, that'll boost our stats. That's gaming. Yeah, that might be gaming. Damn. There's been at least 5 traditional articles and another 15 or 20 blog posts about the initiative, which is pretty good traffic given where we stand in the project. I expect those will continue. The thing that I'm most proud about is the fact that overall we've been recording all of the sessions, all of the steering group calls. We've posted all of the documents. We've kind of been radically open about this grant. We've even published the slightly redacted version of the grant proposal. And those documents have received almost 18,000 downloads over the past year since the project launched. So good traffic. So for more information, as I mentioned, we've been radically open. Almost everything is available on the NISO website. Different presentations, pictures, slides, papers, everything. Also, you can take a look at the white paper. If you have a comment or would like to add your voice to this process, I think the commenting is officially still open. So you can go and post a comment if you'd like. So with that, thank you so much. I think we might have a minute or 2 for questions. Thank you.
Okay, it's Magical Mystery. Look in the back of your conference badge time. So we're going to have the next breakout session.